Hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar. It's so exciting to have so many of you join us. It's been a whirlwind week with a bit of a quick trip to San Diego and back to Sydney. So very excited to be able to share so much with you today. We've got a lot that we're going to cover today, and I guess the theme of what we want to be able to share is some of the key insights from social media marketing world in San Diego that was held last week. It is quite the conference, unlike anything that we see here in Australia. Over 20,000 participants, over 100 different streams, jam-packed into 3 days in San Diego. So it's definitely the conference that we have on our radar here at Mastermind, because what we love about this session is the fact that it's often a really great environment for very small brands. Many of the conferences that we often attend are very focused on the big guys. And so you look at the marketing budgets that are required and what you need to be able to take away from that. And it's not necessarily something that small to medium businesses have to be able to action. So we're going to start today and just give you a bit of an insight into what we learnt. There's more to come. Obviously, we've just got back from off the plane and I've got a fair bit more to share. But by way of introduction, just to introduce myself to those of you who I'm not familiar with on this call, my name is Trish Barry, and 13 years ago I started Mastermind Consulting as a way of helping food, wine and travel brands be able to tell their stories direct to consumer. We've been really fortunate to have an amazing repertoire of brands within our portfolio, and we've helped them with everything from social media marketing to email marketing and a lot of digital strategy, and social media obviously plays a really big role in that. So even of us who live and breathe the world of social need to keep learning, and this is where this conference very much comes into its own. So what I'm going to share with you today, there were over 100 sessions with the last few days, and the ones that I attended were very much focused on the bigger picture trends, looking at paid social, Facebook and consumer behaviour. But as the recordings from the sessions come through over the next few weeks, as a team we'll go back through the recordings and we'll share those key insights on our blog. So expect to see some more messages come out around messenger bots, Pinterest, YouTube marketing, LinkedIn, and customer advocacy, as we've not even started to delve into all of the volume of content that was shared over the last few weeks. So if you're not already following us on our social channels, please make sure that you're doing so. Keep an eye on our blog, because as a team, we've divided up the streams of content and we're each responsible for going through and sharing those key insights on our blog. So we should also mention that many of the slides that I'm presenting today do remain the intellectual property of the presenters that were at the conference, and they were much more integrated into a broader presentation. So what I've tried to do is to pull out the things that resonated most with me as thought provokers for you to think about what you need to embark upon within your social in 2020. I guess the question that has been raised by my team as I came back was, what has changed since last year? Last year was the first year that I attended the conference, and I came back, let's say, with a whole buzz of enthusiasm around, how the platforms were evolving and what we needed to do differently. And upon reflection, actually what the key insights are is that not a lot has changed, but in a sense, we've continued to see a lot of the trends that were identified exacerbated further. So the trends we're seeing become much more pronounced and things evolving in a very different way. So what I urge you to do today, take notes. We will send out these slides and we'll send out the recording from today, but use these trends to think about social media as a tool in your marketing mix. It is not the only element in your marketing communications plan, but you have to integrate social with your broader marketing activities. So interestingly, what else we saw in this in these workshops over the last few days was there was a lot of conflicting ideas. So some speakers were talking about the fact that the marketing funnel as we once knew it is dead, and that the role of social continues to evolve around touch points. But equally, You know, the marketing funnel is very much alive when you think about the fact that some of the initiatives that we're doing deeper down the funnel with customers that we have greater engagement with are very much still real. And there's opportunities, especially with paid social, to think about how we nurture some of those relationships around conversions. So I do believe there's lots of opportunities to start to explore in this space, and it is exciting for many of the brands that you represent here in this webinar today. So what I want to cover today is a little bit of a summary around the market context and just tap into where we are in terms of the state of social media today, and then delve into 4 key trends. And those 4 key trends are around video marketing, content strategy, the role of paid social, and thinking again about the human connection and why we're on these platforms, whether we're a journalist, is media, or we're a travel brand, or we're a winery or a restaurant. Some of these learnings apply regardless of your budget and also regardless of your categories. We will then give you a bit of a quick wrap up on what we think you need to do next. And if we have time, we'll delve into some of the tools that you might be able to add to your toolkit to be able to produce better content. We will not have a lot of time for questions at the end, but we will be sharing the team's details so that if you do have any questions, we'll encourage you to be able to come back to us and reconnect and ask the questions further. So let's kick off looking at the role of social. Social continues to be quite a rapid changing environment, and we're seeing obviously new platforms being added and consumers changing in the way that they're engaging with these platforms. We know though that all the strategies that we used to employ are no longer working, and those of us who have been doing social media right back since the 2006 and 2007 when we engaged very early on, know that the strategies that we employed when we first started on social media are no longer applying. So we have to think differently and we have to change our approach, because the things that we used to do even 2 years ago are no longer going to cut it. We also know that social ad costs are rising. So we know that there's nearly 7 million active advertisers on Facebook alone. And when you have limited supply and increased demand, it's going to be much harder to cut through. And we're very much seeing this with brands who are struggling to get their content out in front of an audience, especially those who used to be able to do it very cost effectively and are not seeing the same results. An interesting point was made about the fact that this is a US election year. And so there will be a lot of political money thrown in the USA into the platform, and this will have an impact on the inventory. So keep in mind that at times when there is, uncertainty or there is major events that are happening, that will have an impact on our budgets and our paid advertising, and we need to adjust accordingly. The other big trend that we're very much aware of at the moment is that consumers are continuing to question brands and question the relationship that they have with many brands in their repertoire. We know that there has been a lot of privacy concerns and that the breaches of privacy across some of the platforms is eroding trust. And that means that we need to be able to think differently about how we're connecting. And that's meaning that the platforms are no longer looking at a broadcast model and they're more moving towards that one-to-one interrelationship. And that's sometimes hard for a brand to think about, because as a brand or as a media partner, or even as a small organization, we have to move from a mass marketing approach to more of a relationship approach. And that's a big shift that we have to mentally go through to be able to do things differently. And then the other big thing that we're seeing across all of the platforms, and we'll talk about this when we come to TikTok, is that the platforms continue to proliferate. So new platforms are added to the mix on a really regular basis. And that means that we need to be fluid and evolve our approach to be able to reach a different audience. All of this means that it's much harder to cut through. So if we think about the fact that Social Media Examiner did a research piece in January looking at some of the key issues for brands in terms of how they're using social media. And you can see some of the findings here that 65% of marketers were saying that their organic reach has declined, or that they have no idea how much their content is getting out in front of people. So we know it's getting harder, and we know that the content that we produce needs to be better. And that's kind of one of the trends that we will delve into today, that we need to be doing, you know, a better job, but not necessarily publishing quite as often. Interestingly, and I know those in the audience who are in the media industry are seeing some of this, that we're seeing tectonic shifts in the value chain of media. So big players are now becoming very much audience companies, and you know, Apple and Microsoft are very good examples of this. So Microsoft bought LinkedIn for $26 billion, not because LinkedIn was the best social media platform, but it gave them access to an audience. Similarly, they bought Minecraft, not because it was the world's best game, but also because it gave them access to a younger demographic. And building audiences is something that brands are starting to think about as much as media partners. You know, the one that they talked about in the US that really is making the most impact is Amazon. So clearly they're thinking about product, they're thinking about their content, they're thinking about a distribution strategy, you know, delivery is being refined through things like drones, and they're thinking about how they're using a multi-channel, multi-device approach to reach their audience. And the trends very much are that this kind of shift between media and brands building audiences will continue to evolve. Now, it's interesting to think about, well, where are some of the platforms going? And it's easy, I guess, to focus on, you know, doing things just to be playing with an algorithm. And what I'd encourage you to do is to think about the way that the algorithms are evolving, but don't necessarily be doing things just to play an algorithm. What was a very interesting point was the fact that many of these social media platforms are listed entities. They're listed on the stock exchange. They have shareholders' value to be able to articulate. And so they need to be able to give cues to the market of where they're heading and what the future is. So taking a look at some of the things like Mark Zuckerberg's statements around the fact that he's not going to improve the newsfeed a lot more. His roadmap for Facebook is very much focused on stories, video, and communities and groups. So thinking about some of these statements that are made gives us some insights in what we need to do next. But what I would encourage you to think about in terms of don't play necessarily to the platforms, think very much around what strategies are important to reach your audience, and then choose the tools and the platforms that resonate most. Don't feel like you have to be on every single platform just because it's a trend. Go back to the heart of what your audience looks like and make sure that you're engaging with them in places that they have a presence. So I'm going to start with the first trend today, which is all about video. And this is nothing new. We've been talking about video being a major trend since 2014. But what is very different is the way that we're using video and the way that we're consuming it. Because when we started talking about social media, you know, back in 2007 when Mastermind was born, we were talking about the adoption of YouTube and some of the earlier video techniques and strategies. But video continues to evolve. And what was very interesting was the trends that were happening, particularly in the US, and keep in mind this was a US conference, so this data is US centric, but I'm sure we'll start to see some similar trends in Australia, that you can see that this streaming war around video is becoming very real. Disney as a player is willing to invest billions of dollars to compete with Netflix. And you can see this data in terms of the most downloaded mobile apps from Q4 2019, that Disney Plus very much is, winning that war in terms of downloads. Number two, as you might see there, is TikTok. So number one is Disney Plus, number two is TikTok. Then you'll see Messenger, Facebook, and YouTube. YouTube is not necessarily represented equally here from a video perspective, because often it will be pre-installed in some applications. So keep in mind that the YouTube numbers here are not necessarily downloadable because it's something that is instantly applied. But what you can see here is this real trend for video, and Variety magazine had said that streaming video content is to jump 29% this year to $24 billion industry. You know, we question, is there any industry on this planet at the moment that is having so much growth? So 632 million people are paying per year, is what they're projected by 2024. And when you look at the impact of 5G as a different network, we're going to see this streaming become much faster and the trend towards video streaming and streaming become more prolific. Now, this trend towards more video is meaning that the types of video we're engaging with and the people are watching TV very differently to what they have in the past. So there is a huge demand for documentary storytelling, and we're seeing a lot of brands, you know, start to think about how they're telling their stories in a more documentary form. It means that as marketers, we need to learn to create videos that are very much entertaining and educational. So we have an opportunity as marketers here to tap into this consumer shift, but we have to think about the storytelling element towards this video documentary style. And remember that the reason that video is important is that it builds trust and it builds loyalty, and that overcomes some of the barriers that we are seeing that consumers are also, you know, not trusting brands, but this is a way to be able to outmaneuver that. So a great example was given by Michael Stelzner in the opening keynote address around the Imagineering story from Disney. And who would have thought that the engineers and the builders of the theme parks would have been such a feature of the story 20 years ago? And yet this video is a really great story piece of those who make the rides at Disney. It shows the people, the creations that we know and love. And we know that when people get behind your brand and your product, it's something that they will talk about. So being able to think about how we're exposing some of the stories is very important behind our brands. And I want to show you a bit of a video as an example of doing less with video, but doing it better. And this is a video that was talked about in a number of sessions throughout last week around a UK hardware store called Hafford Hardware that produced this short video. They produced it on a budget of about $130. To be fair, I think the person who shot it clearly had an eye for video and knew what they were doing. But this is an example. It's a little snippet. You can see the rest of it on YouTube, just to be able to see what is winning the war of video over 2019.
Let's dance in style, let's dance for a while. Heaven can wait, we're only watching the skies. Hoping for the best, but expecting the worst. Are you gonna drop the bomb now? Let us die young and let us live forever. We don't have the power, but we never say never. Sitting in a sandpit, life is a short trip. The music's for the sad man. Can you imagine when this race is won? Turn our golden faces into the sun. Praising our leaders, we're getting into music's played by the madman.
So the video goes for about 2 minutes. So it's just a bit of a glimpse into what, you know, that was actually the video from Christmas that won the hearts and the minds across the internet for 2019. And the point was made that, you know, we had big brands that were going up against this, and this was something that really resonated with the audience. It was authentic, it was real, it was shot one morning, and yet the reach of this communication was something that generated a huge amount of press and a beautiful sentiment around the brand. So when you're thinking about video, maybe take a step back and don't necessarily think about the fact that you need a massive budget and that you need to be Disney with the type of videos that you're producing. There's a way that you can kind of make an entree into video by doing things a little bit differently. And Michael Stelzner made a really good point in his opening. His address, he's the executive of Social Media Examiner. He's the man behind the conference. He made a really good analogy around how we should be using video in our marketing. And it very much depends on where we're at our adoption cycle. So if the first step is that you're not doing anything with video at the moment, you really need to get your feet wet and start to think about how you're going to use stories. And I'll touch on that in a moment. If you're already using stories, either Instagram or Facebook, then you have an opportunity to go further and start experimenting with some entertaining content. Now that may live on TikTok, it may live on YouTube, it very much depends on your brand story. But once you've kind of got your feet wet and know what you're doing, then you can take it further. And then equally start to develop some longer form videos if you have already been playing on video that start to talk about your stories. And the opportunity for many of us, especially smaller brands, is the fact that many marketers are still not using stories in their social media. So this can be raw, it can be very authentic. And interestingly, people are using Instagram stories more than Facebook, and yet Facebook are prioritizing stories as part of their newsfeed algorithm. So think about the fact that there are 500 million people watching stories daily. And Instagram is a really great tool to be able to think about how you're being authentic, to show some behind the scenes content. It doesn't necessarily need to be hugely polished, but you do need to think about how you're using this content to build your brand stories authentically. And there's some really great analytics that you can use to be able to make that happen. Now, it would be remiss of me not to talk about TikTok, and I appreciate that for many brands, including those in our portfolio, TikTok is not the right platform, especially if you're an alcohol or a liquor brand. You know, it is something that we've got to question, is this the most responsible tool to be able to use? But when you look at the downloads that are happening with TikTok, it's something that we can't ignore. There were 738 million downloads of TikTok in 2019. Interestingly, for many brands, and it may be relevant for some in this group, you know, we know that only a small number of marketers are using this platform. And it was interesting when we looked at the feedback of what people needed to know more about at the conference. There definitely was an appetite to understand TikTok more and to think about how we use it. But this really surprised me in seeing that the majority of users on the platform are over 35 years of age. And as a mum of teenage children, this is not surprising. Those who are creating content on TikTok, though, are very much a younger demographic. So what we encourage you to do to think about is to be very aware that this is a trend. People are downloading it, they're using it. That short disposable content may be relevant for some, but it very much depends on your brand story. And a really good example was given about an orthodontist in the USA who was using TikTok as part of their marketing. His name is Benjamin Winters, and he's otherwise known on TikTok as The Bentist, with 72 million likes on the platform. And he's very much made it an entertaining platform to be able to grow his business, to the point that his popularity has meant that he has needed to open a whole nother surgery to be able to cater to the demand, you know, talking about eating candy with braces and having a little bit of fun with his content. So, you know, you can see this piece on the left here has had 205.3 thousand likes with 1,300 comments about talking about eating candy with your braces. So it's not for everyone, but do think about it as an opportunity, if it is right for your brand, to be able to create more engaging content. Now, no surprise to everyone that YouTube is definitely still a really big trend for longer form content. And it very much is the best way to tap into that growing demand for video, especially if the content is around entertainment or it's around education. So there's still 300 hours of video being uploaded to YouTube daily, and it's very much a platform that consumers are engaging with. But how you produce that video potentially also needs to be refined. And a great example was given around Chipotle which is a brand in Mexico, I believe. And they were talking about how they were showcasing the farmers and the suppliers behind their produce to really give that behind the scenes storytelling to their brand. And it was an incredibly successful campaign. It wasn't necessarily all about the product and the benefit of the product, but it was bringing some warmth and some storytelling into the farmers that were behind the brand, and that really resonated with an audience. So think about your video, think about it in a number of stages. It's a trend that is not going away, but regardless of where you are in terms of your strategy, it's something that can't be ignored. Now, just moving on to the second trend, which is about content, and it's impossible to do social without thinking about your content strategy. But the trend across all of the major presenters that were speaking about content was to do less and to do it better. And what people were starting to comment on was that 73% of us are producing more content than we were a year ago. And as Anne Handley pointed out, 43% of us are spending more on content than we were a year ago. Now, that doesn't mean that we potentially need to spend less, but we have to stop and evaluate what we're doing and not just feel that there is a need to be pumping out content on a daily basis, because that's not going to cut it. You know, Jay Bayer put out the comment that we have to stop with the random acts of social content. And the big theme was very much around slowing down to speed up. So Anne Handley gave a keynote on the first day that very much talked about our customers and thinking about making sure that the content that we're creating is very much resonating with our audiences. She asked us to think about what is uniting our audience, what truth is compelling them to act emotionally. And remember that every story that we were talking about is a human one with a universal truth. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. I thought this was probably the most amusing one from the conference, and quite ironic that we're going to talk about cockroaches. But this is a really famous campaign from the Bronx Zoo in America, which I believe is one of the largest zoos in the United States. And they had a very famous campaign that was to name a cockroach on Valentine's Day. And they've been doing this since 2011 as an initiative to be able to raise funds as a fundraiser. One of the things that the Bronx Zoo had is a massive budget. So we know that cockroaches are apparently the critters that will never die and they will live with us forever. So they were taking it as a bit of a romantic gesture, and this campaign continued to have legs. But sometimes you don't necessarily need to do things with a big budget. You just need to show up and do things differently. So the example was shared of the El Paso Zoo, a much smaller zoo with a much smaller operating budget. They decided to take on the big guys and really take this campaign to the next level. There was a member of their marketing team that recognized that they didn't have cockroaches at their zoo, but she sat back and realized that they did have meerkats, and we all know that meerkats eat cockroaches. So they very much launched a successful counter campaign. So instead of naming a roach in the name of one you love, they encouraged you to name a roach after your ex. They showed up, and this campaign gained so much momentum. People loved it, and the virality of this campaign around February the 18th was really important because they'd never done live before. They'd tried to go live and didn't even know what they were doing. The first example was the marketing manager doing a live video that her phone was done sideways, but there became a real interest in this campaign as something different. There was people who were asking who wants a preview of what's to come Thursday, and quite gross. It was a very successful campaign with people lining up in the front doors of the zoo to be able to come in and watch their exes be fed to the meerkats. What they're talking about is the success of this campaign of being able to do things better on a small budget, but also being nimble in your content approach. And it's probably a great example of thinking about how you can be fluid in your approach, thinking about your audience, and then taking it to the next momentum, gaining momentum rather than just saying, oh, I've got another post that was scheduled that needs to be created because it's in the plan. So thinking about social very differently. Robert Rose, who I think is a real, genius in terms of content marketing, also made a really good point about content being the experience. So we have to view our content differently on social than just being a sales funnel. It is a really different role in terms of some of these platforms that are very personal. And we have to think about delivering value to turn the customers into an engaged audience and an addressable audience. The point was made on a number of occasions that for many of us, our strategic content is stuck in average. So some of us have a defined content strategy in place, but the research that they're doing with a lot of big and small businesses is showing that many brands don't even have a formal content strategy. There's no content pillars, they haven't defined their audience, and that just means that they're producing content for the sake of it. And that also means that for many brands, they're navigating what they're calling the corporate silos. And they gave a great example of the Microsoft CMO talking about the fact that they're shopping the org chart. Their content goes out as if consumers are looking at different parts of the organizational chart and the products that are associated with that, rather than thinking about strategic needs to be able to meet their audience. So we need to think differently and flip things on their head and build focus in everything that we're doing in terms of content creation, putting our audience needs above all else. So I encourage you to take a note and say, are you really serving your audience, or are you just pushing product? What are you doing, and what insights to your audience do you have that you need to dig down into further? And does that mean going out and spending a day with your customer and putting yourself in their shoes for a day, talking to them, interviewing them, interrogating them in a lovely way to really get those nuggets of value that means that you can continue to go deeper? So Robert Rose's big takeout for marketers was, it's not about doing it bigger. Sometimes you have to do deeper. And again, less is very much more. Now, the journalists in the room, or those of us who love storytelling, will love this piece. And it was something that was a theme that spoke about probably 3 or 4 sessions around the need to leverage the business of storytelling more. So one of my favorite presenters was Park Howell, who is an advertising man from, long ago. And he reminded us to go back to the basics of storytelling and think about the chemical reaction that has in our brain. So we know that the neurons and the chemical reactions in our brains love good stories. And when we talk about generalized ideas, we often leave people without a question of how we practice it. So he encouraged us to think about our storytelling back to the old days in terms of your beginning, your middle, and your end, and to not rush your stories and make sure that they're well defined. So instead of pumping out potentially 4 blog posts because you have to meet a KPI around content being produced, maybe question if you use all of that time to write one beautiful piece that has a beautiful story. That piece of content will resonate much stronger than just doing 4 for the sake of it to be able to meet a KPI. The same sentiment was very much referred to by a number of speakers around content strategy about scaling down over scaling up. And Tyler McCall, who's one of the leading Instagram experts, was very much talking about how we're using Instagram and expecting it to drive sales. And yet the platform was never, ever designed for that case. Oh, excuse me. The most engaging Instagram accounts are very much those that get their customers to love them the most. And they need to be prepared to go back to the metrics around building connections, building direct messages, thinking about how they're nurturing community rather than just measuring metrics around this is something that is going to drive website traffic, because the community is the strongest part of why we're on some of these platforms, and it's something that we need to think about doing very differently. Now, Tyler gave a really good framework for brands that have under 10,000 followers. And he talked about the fact that with over 10,000 followers, yes, there is a tendency to be able to say, swipe up to get to my website. But if you're a smaller brand with a smaller community, you sometimes can do a much better job of engaging with people and looking at the engagements and the conversations that you're cultivating. So building a connection is what is really important on Instagram, especially when you have a smaller following. So he was encouraging us to be able to think more about fostering conversations than driving revenue, and start to think about creating a community that you can use to amplify your brand. We were fortunate to hear from a number of Instagram success stories. I hate the word influencers, but Instagram success stories of people who have really built their brand on the platform. And I think what was really important from an Instagram point of view was to really recognize that for many brands, this is the visual storytelling platform that you're on. But again, there is often a need to just feel like you've got to post for the sake of it. And Jasmine STARR used a really good analogy that if you're not using Instagram strategically, you're throwing spaghetti against a wall. It's not going to stick, and it's not the same as Facebook. So if you're trying to do the same thing on Instagram as you are on Facebook, then you're going to be set up to fail. So recognize the areas of the algorithms that'll work, which include the explore feed, the hashtag use, the news feed, and look at what people are looking at and what they're engaging with, and use the really rich analytics behind the platform to know what you need to do more of. Jasmine STARR's number one takeaway was that the fastest way on Instagram to grow is to really build your brand. And to do that, you need to know what your stories are and what you stand for. The same sentiment was echoed by Jen Herman in her Instagram sessions. And she kept reminding us that we need to make sure that the content stands out. So post with a purpose and not for the sake of it. And she also made a good point about the fact that we now have dark mode on our phones. So think about the way that your content is being viewed in dark mode, because it may be different to the way it's been consumed in the past. Some good tips from Jasmine that I thought were worth sharing. So she was talking about how she's used the Instagram stories as a way to test and learn with an audience before she posts to the feed. So she gave this example of Halloween last year. And as you can see, they're all three, very attractive images here that are quite engaging. But she used these three over a week in the lead up to Halloween to understand what was going to resonate most. So what sort of imagery, what sort of messaging, what sort of communication she needed to be able to put out there. And once she had a better understanding of that, then she was able to put that out onto the feed and get much better engagement. Now, this is it's a very different approach than sitting and planning a content calendar, because it is very fluid, and it means that you need to be thinking about your social quite differently. But she also made the point about the fact that you can start to think about the language of your communication quite differently. So instead of saying I'm at hashtag SMMW20, Social Media Marketing World 20, and the fans and followers not necessarily engaging with this, think about how you can use the insights and where you are to be able to tell a story. And she used this example of coming up with a few templates to be able to say, this is my story template that I can communicate. Greetings from San Diego. I'm at Social Media Marketing World, giving space there to be able to annotate as she's loading and put in the relevant locations and hashtags, and then give value back to her audience. It's not about her, it's about her audience. So thinking about the top things that she's learned as a way of sharing that knowledge out to the community. So a good litmus test that was spoken about by a number of players is, if you're looking at the content and the logo was to fall off, would your audience know that it's yours? Because if it looks generic, you're not doing it justice to your brand. So use this as a really good way of being able to audit your content and make sure that it's telling your stories. Okay, so I'm on to the third trend, which is the role of paid social. And I guess this has been a difficult part because there were really technical sessions that we attended in terms of, you know, what is going on with paid social? What do we need to know about how we're engaging? And experts like Mari Smith and John Loomer, who, you know, we turn to for a lot of our insights, very much shared some technical insights. And I think what is really important to recognize is that it's more important than ever to be able to put paid social, an amplification of some of your paid social, because we know it's getting competitive. But if you're doing it very strategically and you spend the time thinking about it, it will pay off to make sure that your content is getting out to the right audiences. So you may need to rethink the way that you're doing paid social. And it may mean that you need to spend more time on the planning and the testing to be able to drive those results. But there's definitely some really strong learnings to be able to think about. And it was fabulous to be able to see some Australians up on the stage. And one of the really good analogies that was given at this session by one of the Google experts was to be able to think about our paid strategy and how it's often being split between Facebook or paid social and AdWords. And often brands are using them in isolation or could have two different agencies managing those. However, if we think about the customer journey, the customers are actually often on the same highway. They're not using social in isolation. They may use social to look at their friends, and then they'll often go to Google. So thinking about them as different lanes on the same highway and the fact that you can have bridges between them is really important. So it's an important thing to think about, you know, if you're not using Google ads, it's something to be considering, especially for many brands that are tourism related or are food related, of which you're looking for conversions. You know, use the paid media strategically and do that accordingly. It's also important to think that the Facebook organic reach continues to decline. And yet there was quite some controversy between Mari Smith, who we think is one of the gods of Facebook marketing, and Michael Stelzner, who was arguing that Facebook reach is dead. And this, I guess, is something we're seeing with a lot of our Mastermind clients, that it's not necessarily the case. We're still seeing organic reach on some content that could be up to 50% of the audience if the organic reach is strong. So don't necessarily think that organic reach is totally dead on the platforms. Generally, that is the case, but think about how you're using your strategic content to be amplified. And Mari talks about it as the Mari method. So one of the things that she's encouraging us to think about to overcome some of that decline of organic reach is to think about the funnel of how we're targeting people, and think about the fact that the algorithms are loving video content, especially on Facebook, to be able to drive reach and engagement. Now, if you follow up that content further down the funnel and you don't just think about boosting and amplifying post by post, you can then start to dig deeper and build custom audiences to build conversions and allocate your budget accordingly. And it may be that you're quite happy to pay more money to acquire a really warm lead who is engaged with your brand very quickly, if it's appropriate to do so, to drive that conversion. So thinking strategically about your budgets and segmenting is pretty critical. Equally, John Loomer, who it looks quite confronting here, but John hates being on a stage, and there's not a lot of great photos of John Loomer. You know, this is the only session apparently that John Loomer will stand up in front of an audience each year and address an audience at Social Media Marketing World. And, you know, he's very knowledgeable and gave some really great case studies of how he was actually targeting people in the room who were within a 1 mile radius, who love social media, who were potentially visiting Social Media Marketing World, and the different strategies he was engaging to show us how the tools work. And it was incredibly powerful to see him show in a really live example some of the things that we're doing day to day to connect with our clients' audiences, because you actually can do some strategic things using the tools in Facebook to be able to grow. So evaluate the different consumer segments and think about how you bid accordingly, and recognize that we hate the word boost, but you can strategically amplify your content to the right audience to make a difference. So I come to the final trend around why it is called social. And I think this is an interesting one. There was a number of speakers that were talking about, well, what is the ROI on social media and how should we be measuring it and how is it used to be able to drive sales? And it comes back to the one important point about why it is actually called social. It is a tool to be able to connect, and we wouldn't necessarily be judging the ROI of a telephone in a business that is there to give customer service. And I encourage you to think back to social about being a platform to connect with your audience. As Mark Schaefer, one of the famous strategists and one of the greatest marketing minds at the moment, is saying, the most human company wins. So we have to readjust the metrics and stop counting likes and start counting conversations, because we need to choose to serve and not to sell. So there's those of you who are old enough who might have studied marketing at university, showing my age here, about a textbook I used to have and study with Kotler. And Kotler used to talk about the different psychology of marketing. And I think this is a really important point, that there is a real hunger in our world for intimacy and experience. And brands need to be more human and authentic to be able to survive. They should stop trying to be perfect and think about how we show up. And we know that those human-centric brands should treat customers as friends and becoming a really integral part of their lifestyle. So become approachable, become likable, and even vulnerable. And I have to say that I'm guilty of this myself. I hate being in front of a video. And, sitting in this session actually forced myself to go outside and get in front of a video camera and try and lose the fear that you didn't need to be perfect, but to be real and to be authentic. And that's what social needs to be. So I'd encourage you to kind of think, we don't need to be perfect, play to that vulnerability, and really start to think about how we will connect. Now, Mark Schaefer is the gentleman who wrote a book last year called Marketing Rebellion. And he had a different keynote this year that was very much talking about how do we win the war on attention. It's cluttered, there's advertising everywhere, it's very difficult to cut through. So he asked ourselves to stop and ask ourselves a number of questions to really redefine what we stand for as a brand. And he said, to start, ask yourself the question about only we. Only we as a brand can do things this way. Only we doesn't mean that we are a family-owned winery that is producing grapes. What do you stand for? What do you value? What do you put your stamp on that makes you different? And once you understand that, then you have to dig deeper and ask yourself, well, what is our culture and what are our conversations? So, for example, if you have a culture that is quite risk averse, that's okay, but you're not going to go out with a campaign like the El Paso Zoo did and actually be really risky. So thinking about what you stand for and your appetite for conversations is a way that you can cut through and really understand what impact you're going to make. How can we maneuver, and what sorts of really rich content can we provide to really make ourselves feel really human? And he made the point about making the use of some user-generated content and not being too scared to be honest and vulnerable. So often we see stock imagery being used in campaigns because brands don't have a lot of imagery to leverage. And that's often true for brands on smaller budgets that feel like they need to be able to go out there and have something that looks professional. Now, don't get me wrong, there is absolutely a need at sometimes in the marketing mix to have great images. But what we're encouraging you to do is to put the people in the photos and be human. And they gave the example of Walmart Charlene. Now, Walmart Charlene was very much an employee in Maryland in the USA that's known for her store as being quite a grumpy character. But she has a passion for the brand and the business. So using her passion and using her authenticity was a really good way that Charlene made it on Good Morning America and really started to build some of the stories behind the brand. This sentiment about being human and thinking about the customer experience was echoed very much by, my favorite presenter at the conference, a gentleman called DUNCAN WARDLE. Now, Duncan used to be the brand experience manager for Walt Disney for 20 years. He's one of those people they talked about getting Buzz Lightyear to the moon, who literally actually achieved that goal and, sent Buzz up to space and started to think very differently. And he was very confronting in the sessions that he made us do. We had to take pieces of paper and we had to create our favorite Disney character behind our backs as a way of changing our paradigm of thinking. And you can see my really poor attempt at, I confess it was supposed to be Mickey Mouse, but it looks a little bit more like Maleficent on the left-hand side here. And the really good thing that he made us really challenge is that we're dealing with people and we have to think really differently about how we're entertaining them, loving and nurturing those people, and thinking about how we're reinventing the customer experience on an ongoing basis to keep our brands fresh and relevant. So people at the heart of our social strategy is a really core thing to be able to think through. And I know that we've covered a lot today, but I just want to spend a moment to recap on some of those key considerations that you need to think about. The first one that we talked about is that the world of social continues to evolve. And I want you to think about that differently and open your eyes to things that you may not have considered. That may be that if Facebook is thinking about improving Messenger, that you need to be engaging with Messenger a lot more in your communication mix, one-on-one, differently, to be able to build that consumer connection. So be fluid in your approach and think about what you need to do to cut through to really connect with your consumer. The second point to make is that video is not going away. So do more of it across the platforms and use it as a way of building a connection with your brand. Think about the ways that we talked about, that stories is the first entree in. The second opportunity potentially could be some more entertaining content. And then this really big trend in terms of thinking about more broadcasting, documentary style, storytelling pieces has a huge opportunity to build the trust and connection with your brand. And we're seeing that very much with our Mastermind clients as a trend that is working. We're doing more video, but less polished. We're getting the people who are behind the brands on the cameras and letting them tell their stories in a way that's real. It means that we have to interview them and interrogate them really differently, but their authentic stories are really resonating with their audience and building trust. So if you're going to have a cinema ad, yes, you might need an amazing video with a $300,000 production value, but go back and think about the hardware store example and think about how we can do a really good job by just thinking differently. I then want you to focus on your content. So the first question is, do you have a strategy in place? Because if you're just doing content for the sake of it, you're throwing spaghetti up against a wall. So do less content, but do it better. And we're often asked the question, should we be posting 4 or 5 times a day? Should we be posting daily? The answer to that depends on what you have to communicate. Some big publishing brands absolutely can afford to be publishing content multiple times a day. But for many of our small businesses that we work with, it's a matter of thinking strategically and making sure that we're doing the content that resonates. So reevaluate the role of content, and you might need to think quite differently about the way that you shave your content mix. It may mean that you allocate budgets differently and spend more money on video editing than you might on written content. Or it might mean that you actually need to think about more money being put behind getting the content to your audience. And that takes me to the third point around paid social. As marketers, we are very excited about the opportunity for paid social and AdWords. Those two big platforms are where the majority of digital spend is happening. But we also understand that there are ways that we can connect to our audience in a really meaningful way that doesn't feel like we're spamming them if we're building a relationship. So spend time and get the strategy right. Call in the experts. It may mean that you need to go and pay for a Facebook advertising course or a paid social course, or call in the experts. But there's a huge opportunity to think about the return on your investment by making sure you've got a strong paid social plan in place. Finally, remember to be human. So social is not here for selling. So let's stop using it as a metric to be able to value sales and to put those metrics in place. So care about your audience and you'll build rapport and trust. Have a fluid approach, but very much keep focused on your brand strategies and stories, because what you do will depend very much on your brand plan and your strategic vision. So a couple of actions we have talked about as we go through. The first thing that I want you to do as an action today is to go away and revisit your plans. Think about what we have shared today, audit your content strategy, and think about what needs to evolve in 2020. Question, how can you make your brand story stand out? And this applies whether you're a journalist or you're a travel provider or you're a food producer or you're a winery. You have to know what you stand for and what your key messages are to be able to cut through. Finally, think about, what people in your company can you use to be able to help your story real and engaging? And these are often the people that build the authenticity and the trust in your brand. If your CEO or the people that are in your organization hate being put in front of the camera, find someone who can authentically convey the story and can be the face of your brand. We've seen it work in so many instances where we've managed to use employees who have huge passion for the brand and can really be able to articulate that story. So before I wrap up, I do have a couple of tools that I want to share with you before we finalize the presentation today. But keep in mind that we're here to help. So you've got my contact details. The Mastermind team is a small but mighty one, and we'd love to be able to answer any questions that you have. So keep an eye on our blog over the next few weeks. And as we digest our way through the 100 different sessions that we're about to sit back through, we'll share those key insights. But I'm going to finalize today with some tools for the toolkit. And the reason that we don't talk about the tools as this is a major outtake for you to be able to leverage is that these products are tools. They are not necessarily what you need to be doing differently. But for some of us, regardless of our budget, there are ways to be able to create more authentic content. So the first one of those that I want to refer to is what Mari Smith referred to as her favorite new platform. And it's a product that is called InVideo. So it's kind of like a template for video creation. You can see that there is over 2,000 different templates that cover every major industry and user, with a number of different royalty images in there. And it also has the additional benefit of the text-to-speech commentary across the top. So you can see that you have the ability to be able to create video easily in a number of different platforms. It's a pretty cost effective, I think it's about $5 US per month, but it's a great way of being able to create video when you may not have some video production skills. Keep in mind some of these that have templates are really great, but don't forget that the authentic video content really needs to work best. Other one for you to use that was a big one last year is called Animoto. There's another one called Wave that was really popular at the conference. So a number of tools out there that can help you be able to create video. One of our absolute favorites is a platform that we use on our mobile phones called InShot. And InShot allows you to be able to capture the video content on your phone and then be able to crop it accordingly depending on the platform. So taking your video in a horizontal format on your phone and then cropping it to square for an Instagram post, it gives you a lot of creativity to be able to use your phone as a way of producing fabulous video. Now, it would be remiss of me to not mention some of the favorites, and some of these have been around for a while. So one of the favorite platforms that we use is Canva. Another great one is an Australian company called Easel. So again, two really good project-based platforms that are there to be able to help you tell some great visual stories when you don't have a graphic designer in-house. Another one from an infographic point of view is called visme.com. So another great platform here that you can do using great infographics. Another one that was talked about a lot that we haven't had a chance to play with yet is called Digital Juice. And for those of you who are looking to create Instagram stories, one that was mentioned quite a few times was called Unfold. If you're looking for tools to be able to create great Instagram stories, there's definitely some very fabulous content pieces out there with templates, whether it's Easel or whether it's Canva or it's Unfold. Just go and Google Instagram stories templates, and there's so many that you can have a look at. Another one that was mentioned quite often in some of the sessions was called Design Lab. So again, it's something that you can download to your phone and use it as a way of being able to create much stronger content on the go on your mobile phone. And finally, the session, there was a product called Giphy. I don't know if some of you have created brand GIFs. And we've just done this for a number of our Mastermind clients, and it's a great way of being able to create a little bit more interaction and fun. So we've got dancing wine bottles, and you know, I love wine bottle brands on some of our clients' accounts. So have a play around with Giphy and think about how you can use it to be able to tell your stories. So that wraps up the presentation today. I really appreciate everyone spending so much time with us. I know that there was a lot to cover, and I'm sure that your heads are spinning with so much to be able to share. If you do have questions, please feel free to send me an email. So trish@mastermindconsulting.com.au. We will be doing these webinars regularly throughout the year. It's something that we do find provides a fair bit of value to our clients and some of the people within our community. And, you know, we love to be able to share our knowledge. So if you do have any questions, we'd love to hear from you. And yeah, thank you very much for your time and for letting us share the insights into what was absolutely an action-packed week.